Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking everyone for joining me today. I'm Melissa Wooten, the Senior Program Officer for Career Development here at the William T. Grant Foundation. And one of the programs that I manage is the William T. Grant Scholars Program. We're very excited to have you today. We're going to be spotlighting what it looks like to propose a study on improving the use of research evidence. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. It will become available online in about a week's time. And so if there's something that you would like to refer back to, you'll have that available for you. Also, to let you know that you can submit questions throughout this presentation. Some of you have already submitted questions, and we've drawn from those to structure our conversation today. And in terms of what we're going to do today, I'm going to begin by talking about some of the programmatic details for the William T. Grant Scholars Program. And then we're actually going to spend a fair amount of time focusing on what it looks like to put together a proposal for the improving the use of research evidence priority area. We're going to do that through a conversation. We've invited two current scholars, Amanda Raffoul and Valerie Shapiro, and the three of us are going to have a conversation that's structured around some of the questions that were sent in and a few other things that I think will be helpful for people to have an understanding of. After that conversation with Amanda and Valerie, I'll close things out by offering some application tips, giving a little bit of insight into the review process and a few other things that I hope will be helpful for people to have an understanding of. All right. So to go ahead and just dive into some top level things about the William T. Grant Scholars Program. This is one of our career development awards. It provides 5 years of funding. We actually recently increased the funding amount from $350,000 to $425,000 so that we could further invest and further reinforce our commitment to providing early career scholars with opportunities to develop their craft. The goals of the program are twofold. We are funding a research project, but we're largely funding people's ability to expand their expertise. And so that distinguishes the William T. Grant Scholars Program from a traditional research grant. A traditional research grant, we're funding an individual or a team at the point of application with all the skills that are required to carry out that research project. A career development award is not only funding a person's research, but also giving the person the opportunity to say, in order to fully execute this project, there are some ways in which I need to grow and develop my research skills, and I need additional funding in order to do that. The funding might be providing me with time and space to do that, so I could step out of the classroom. The funding might be providing time and space for me to take up additional courses. But the idea is that you are being funded not only to develop a particular research project, but also to grow and expand your research skills. And so with that being the goal of the program, those two components, we require two things within the application. You have to provide us with a research plan or a research narrative, but you also have to develop a mentoring plan that talks about the ways in which you're going to expand your skills, the ways in which you're going to grow your expertise, and how you're going to go about doing that. And in particular, who is going to help you do that. Within the grants framework, you have to have at least one mentor. We cap it at two, but essentially 1 to 2 senior scholars who are going to play a significant role in guiding you through that research process. And we've got some questions prepared with Valerie and Amanda to help us think about how you go about choosing mentors. The program aims to fund promising early career researchers. For our purposes, early career goes through the first 7 years after you've earned your doctorate, or if you've earned a medical degree, it's the first 7 years after the completion of your first residency. We don't worry about the month in which your degree was earned. We simply take the year that your degree was earned and add 7 to it. And if you're within that total, you are still eligible for the award. This award also aims to fund people who are within career ladder positions. For most people, that means you're in a tenure track position. However, with the proliferation of different types of careers within higher education and even the pursuit of alternate academic careers, we do have flexibility for what we think about as fitting within the career ladder definition. And so the core thing to keep in mind for a career ladder position is there has to be a clear progression from some entry-level position to a higher level position, and your progression has to be by and large determined by your research productivity. And so if you're not in a traditional tenure track position and you have questions about it, you can email us at our info account and we can get into the particulars or specifics of your situation and make a determination. Another thing to keep in mind about the William T. Grant Scholars Award is that we only accept applications on a limited submission process. And so we allow applications, one person per college or division. So like if you have a College of Arts and Sciences, they can put forth one person, but within the same academic institution, within the same university. The med school could put forward another person, or the College of Fine Arts could put forth another person. But the idea is that it's only one person per college or division. And because of that, institutions may actually have an internal process that they use to select people. And so if you're interested in applying for the Scholars Award, it's useful to make that known early so that you can understand what processes your institution may use. To support the career development and growth as a foundation staff, we do organize some different opportunities. We have an annual Scholars Retreat where grantees can come and workshop the project throughout the 5 years. And we also allow grantees who have the Scholars Award to attend other foundation organized meetings. It could be meetings around mixed methods if that's what you're using, or if you're within the reducing inequality priority, they have their own meeting, and the same thing for the use of research evidence researchers. Some things to keep in mind about the foundation. Any application to the William T. Grant Scholars Program needs to fit within the foundation's research priorities. The first one to have in mind is that you have to propose a project that holds the potential to improve outcomes for youth ages 5 to 25 in the US. And so that's one of the core things to know about the foundation, that it is focused on youth within the US and youth who are age 5 to 25. The second thing to keep in mind is that your application should fit within one of our 2 focus areas. I'm going to talk briefly about the reducing inequality focus area just to let you know about that. But again, most of our time today will be focused on the improving the use of research evidence priority area. And so within this priority area, reducing inequality, we are focused on funding research projects that hold the potential to reduce inequality based along the following. We talk about them as dimensions of inequality. You could think about them as axes of identity as well. We're interested in economic standing, race, ethnicity, sexual or gender minority status, language minority status, or immigrant origins. And the core thing to know about this priority area is we do not fund projects that help us further understand inequality or that illuminate a new form of inequality. We are really interested in thinking about how do you actually reduce the inequalities that are well established within the literature that youth contend with. And so projects within this funding priority have to offer a theory of change around if we implement this intervention within a system, or if we think about a particular policy. That could be a policy around child poverty. It could be a policy that has to do with the educational system. But the idea is that if we implement a policy, we will see reductions in inequality. And so it could be thinking about if we have a policy that's looking at the child tax credit. And if certain families receive that, do we actually see reductions in the level of poverty that children from lower socioeconomic statuses face versus those families that were not recipients of the child tax credit? And so again, the idea is that we are looking to have research projects that are built around the idea of there are some promising practices out there and what would actually happen if we implemented them. Would outcomes improve for youth? All right, for improving the use of research evidence, one of the core questions that this priority area is trying to get at is the idea of, if you could think about our reducing inequality portfolio, and if we actually identify some promising strategies that holds potential to reduce inequality for youth, what would it look like to actually get practitioners to take up those policies? Practitioners who are situated within youth serving settings or within institutions that youth interact with, that youth participate in. How can we actually get practitioners, get leaders within those organizations to take up those policies? And so that's a question in and of itself. What would it look like to ensure that more practitioners within youth serving settings could be exposed to research evidence and actually implement evidence-based policies and practices? And so what conditions would you need to foster to make that happen? What organizational configurations might be necessary to facilitate the use of research evidence or to improve the use of research evidence? Those are questions worthy of study in and of themselves. And so that's one of the core issues that this priority area is grappling with. And to dive a little bit further into that and to provide some texture to this conversation and also offer some concrete examples of funded projects, we've invited two current scholars whose projects fit within the Improving the Use of Research Evidence priority area to discuss this with us. And so I'm going to invite Valerie and Amanda to come on screen and join us. Hi, Valerie. Hi, Amanda. Thank you for being with us today. And so I'll just start by introducing you both, and then we'll just go ahead and dive into our questions. And so Amanda Raffoul is joining us from the University of Toronto, and so thank you for being with us today. And Valerie Shapiro is joining us from the University of California, Berkeley. And so one of the things that a successful applicant has to do is describe their research interests and how those research interests fit within the foundation's priorities. And one of the things that the three of us talked a little bit about is oftentimes one of the challenges that people who end up in the Improving the Use of Research Evidence priority area faces, there's not a natural home for that research. So the first question that I'll ask for you is if you can help us understand what you're studying, but also at what point did you realize that what you were studying actually fit within the use of research evidence area? And so Amanda, I'll go ahead and start with you. And so what are you studying and how did you come to see that as being aligned with the use of research evidence?
Sure. Thanks, by the way, Melissa, for hosting us. So my work involves taking a look at population level or policy level contributors to eating disorder risk, especially among young people. And in my position at the time, I was doing a lot of work directly with youth advocates who were involved in meeting with state policymakers on eating disorder policies. So in particular, we were really actively working on one piece of legislation to regulate the sale of harmful diet pills to people under the age of 18, and we were working across several states. And initially, this was just a public health oriented project that evolved into advocacy. But I very quickly realized that when young people were meeting with state policymakers and presenting evidence themselves, it seemed like there was a shift in the environment, a shift in the conversation, and the policymakers were interpreting and it seemed like applying the research evidence that the youth were presenting quite differently than the way it would be received when I was presenting it, for example. And so I took a look at whether or not there was any literature exploring this phenomenon, and there wasn't. There wasn't anything out there around state policymakers and how youth advocacy influenced the way they used research evidence. And most of the work that involved youth relaying research evidence or generating their own was focused on community or school-based settings. And so that influenced me taking a look at the use of research evidence space so I could look at how youth advocacy influences policymakers' use of research evidence when it comes to eating disorders prevention, but mental health sort of related policies overall.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate and kind of love how that unfolded. Like it reminded me of almost like a mini grounded theory, like you're seeing something and then you turn to the literature to try to understand. And it turns out that there is this whole body of evidence that can help you. And so, Valerie, did you have a similar experience where you were like in the field and noticed something, or how did things unfold for you?
Mine was a little different. Thank you also, Melissa, for hosting us. I squarely saw my research interest as attempting to improve the lives of young people, so I knew it fit into the foundation broadly. But the way I would have described my interest at the time was trying to prevent youth mental behavioral problems in schools. And I would always have to have the caveat that I wasn't interested in treatment the way many social workers are, but that I was trying to develop infrastructure for actually effectively implementing programs, and I was lamenting the gap between research and practice. And so I was thinking a lot about that gap, but I was using an NIH lens that really talked about this as a translational problem, and specifically translation type 2, as NIH scholars call it, one of implementation or dissemination, where we were really thinking about a pipeline and saying, we know this works, but why can't we take it to scale for population impact? And so the project that I did was doing right before I proposed my application to the Scholars Program was just studying a school-based SEL program, a social emotional learning program, and noticing and myself asking questions about how do the educational leaders really shape the implementation process? And then it really mattered how they were thinking about and using the evidence that said the program worked, but to what extent were they taking that up? And so I really came from that lens and found myself reading things like Meredith Honig's book, Confronting Complexity, and I just discovered I was really into that exact complexity, which I think you need a lot of curiosity about the uptake of research evidence in and of itself in order to take a deep dive into a whole new literature, which is ultimately what I had to do. And I also realized that the people that were doing work in this area were really doing community engaged scholarship through research practice partnerships. And I knew that I wanted to do that kind of work as well. So those were things that really struck me as I began this journey.
Oh, Melissa, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Are you able to hear me now? Okay, great. I was saying thank you. I like the way that your process kind of differed from Amanda's in terms of you were maybe had like a slightly more formed research question, were in the literature and finding it versus thinking about like in the field. And so I think that that's useful for people to realize that there are like multiple paths into this area of improving the use of research evidence. And also thank you both for like highlighting some of the resources that you use in terms of thinking about particular literatures, and Valerie for thinking about like particular scholars as well that sort of helped you identify that. And so one of the things that I mentioned in the overview was that the Scholars Award is a 5-year career development grant where we're funding both the research project, but the opportunity for someone to think about how they want to grow and expand their career. And so, Valerie, this time I'll start with you. It would be helpful if you could tell us, you've told us a little bit about the project that led you into research evidence, but if you could draw on that a little bit more, dig into it a little bit more, and help us think about how that led you to the Scholars Program, and what type of career development were you hoping to achieve with the Scholars Grant? Like, why not just a research grant? Why was Scholars a good fit for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started digging into the use of research evidence area, which, by the way, if you do wtgrantfoundation.org and just go to /the-library, you can filter by URE topics and get an entire orientation, like a whole library to this literature, which I would strongly suggest. I really, really deeply sought to understand the application guidelines, and not just the scholars application guidelines, but the URE portfolio, as if I was going for a large grant. That really helped me to understand what the foundation's priorities were, and to kind of do some gap spotting, as we would say to a doctoral student, like what have we learned in this area and what is still to be learned. And what I decided would be a good confluence. Well, first I should say I really was interested in the Scholars Program as instead of a major grant, because I had a lot to learn still. I was not ready to say I have all the skills and I can carry out the project. I was ready to say I have a lot of skills, but I would like to go on a parallel process where I am producing research and learning, and those would be synergistic. And I think that's a really good way to think about a scholars application, is if carrying out the research will not just generate knowledge, but will generate your professional development. And if that's true, then the Scholars Program is a really great fit. So I was really interested in the way knowledge is transmitted from research to practice, or from practice to research, through intermediaries, which are many different things, but in my case, really knowledge brokers. And I do that in the SEL space. And I just saw that a lot of the research evidence, or a lot of the literature was suggesting, finding evidence in scholarly journals, and things that is not how a lot of educational leaders that I was meeting with were looking for research evidence. They were using the internet. They were looking to websites that were trusted curators of evidence, and grabbing evidence from there. So I wanted to study these intermediaries that had websites. This is another tip, I think, is to take the foundation really seriously in terms of their verbs. When they say reducing inequality, the reducing part matters. And when they say improving use of research evidence, the improving part matters. So it wasn't just about seeing whether or not websites do transmit evidence, but it's about seeing if websites could be optimized through some kind of continuous improvement process to actually become better at promoting the use of research evidence. So promoting being the verb, or improving. And in order to do that, I did need to figure out some new measurement strategies, because none of the measurement strategies that were in the really awesome repository, the URE measurement repository, were really aimed at those websites. So my goal was to test and validate measures, and then to see if I could optimize the website to promote URE among educational leaders. And in order to do that, I needed skills for big data, because I was used to doing survey research with much smaller numbers, and websites generate millions of hits. So I needed that. I needed to learn a lot about more efficient experiments, that if I modified something on the website, how do I actually do that? It's not really a randomized trial, it's a multi-arm study. So I was doing that on one hand, so sort of new research methods and analysis techniques for this work that I had never done before, but also I needed to do a lot more digging into some of the interdisciplinary theories, the information science for a website, since I hadn't done that, and because my expertise was in SEL. But also, I always had this sense that I was not from education. I was not a teacher or a school administrator, and I didn't come through a PhD program in education. And so to make my research really relevant to practice, I felt like I needed to really become more embedded in research practice partnerships that would help that translation of my own work. So that's really what shaped my goals there.
Like the multifaceted nature of things that you were looking to do. And I also like the way that you talked about a research project not just being about results, but also being about opportunities to learn something about yourself as a scholar. And I do think that's a really useful orienting framework. And so, Amanda, I'm curious, for you, what sorts of things were you looking to develop, and how did that connect to the questions you were posing?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Valerie said right at the beginning, that the WT Grant Foundation's resources on the use of research evidence were the best primer for someone new to the space, and really provided like a good foundation, a good framework for understanding the broader literature. So I'll echo that for people who are just getting into this. When it comes to the career growth and development I was hoping to get out of the grant, I mentioned that I had been doing work with youth advocates. I had been doing work on or examining youth-related health outcomes. I had been doing work examining policy-related outcomes, but I had never been trained in actually applying methodologies that people from education, sociology, and political science had been doing to engage with those audiences a lot more properly. And so when I put together the grant, I did it very intentionally to try and expand on two areas. The first was around getting actual training in youth participatory action research and youth engaged research, because doing work on youth or doing work to identify patterns among youth isn't the same as actually engaging the young people. And given that this project was inspired by real world experiences of working with the young people, I thought that that was something important. And it's the kind of set of methodologies or expansion of skills or stretch of skills that can happen quite easily when you're a grad student or even a postdoc. But when you're faculty, it's really challenging to get the opportunity to expand into a new area of research and to gain new method skills. So one of them was around that youth engaged research practice. And the second was around building a more robust theoretical knowledge of use of research evidence. I think like a lot of other people who were trained in schools of public health, even those of us that evaluate policy, we are not taught about the use of research evidence. We just assume our work lands in the right hands and that people will use it and that'll be that. So I was really interested, of course, to see that there's a space where people have studied the process and the mechanisms that get research evidence to actually be put to use by key decision makers. And so those were two sort of like methods or theoretical areas that I wanted to expand on. And that's why I really thought this was a unique opportunity to do that. And then I also highlighted a couple of other areas in the award that I could build upon what I already have. So around developing frameworks for mental health prevention policy outside of just eating disorders, but also learning about how to actually engage with key policy stakeholders. Again, something that I had been doing in advocacy, but not really in a research capacity. And so those two areas, as well as the ones I mentioned before, built on my existing experience and research in a way that was feasible, but made like a really clear expansion for my career development.
Thank you. One of the things that I hope was clear is just like the range, not only of research topics, but of methodologies. And so thinking about issues related to measurement is really different than thinking about youth participatory action research. Valerie mentioned like big data, also thinking about like some multi-arm things. Again, really different than thinking about the ways in which Amanda's research is sort of like following the policy process to understand what happens when you embed evidence at particular phases, but also from particular actors and what happens. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and ask you, I'll just pose this for you, Valerie. We got a lot of questions about how do you choose mentors. And so I thought it would be helpful if you could tell us a little bit about the 5-year mentoring plan. I know many people just focus on the first 2 years because that's a little bit easier to conceive when you're applying. But I think it would also be useful for people to understand how much of your mentoring plan was around the use of research evidence versus some of those other like data management things that you mentioned, and also methodological things that you mentioned.
My mentoring plan, well, in full transparency, it was not good the first time I submitted it, and I am someone who had to resubmit multiple times in order to receive this award. And my fundamental weakness the first time was my mentoring plan, and in part it wasn't well enough developed, and in part it was not speaking to the research plan well enough. They weren't integrated enough where you almost, by the time you got to the mentoring plan, by the time I did get the award, it had previewed, my research plan had previewed all my mentoring goals. They just made perfect sense together in alignment. So I would say that a lot of my mentoring plan, I think it was about half and half. My methods, my analysis, and getting to know those two other goals that were about the interdisciplinary theories and practice contexts. But I don't think either of those were explicitly about getting to know the URE literature. I really feel like to get the award, I needed to do that work first. In conversations, I had the good fortune of sitting down with Kim at a conference before submitting and talking through with her about some ideas. And I felt at that time, wow, I didn't know the research literature as well as I wanted to. I didn't understand that things that are apparent in the submission guidelines, like that the foundation wants to think about educational leaders or decision makers as opposed to how a classroom teacher might use evidence. And so that's why I would reiterate, read that guide really carefully and read the resources, and then do some citation chaining in order to get to really know the literature. I think that was really important. And so that, as I reapplied, I realized I needed to do that homework preemptively, and then it was a deepening, I would say, while I've been funded. Some of the components of my mentoring plan really ultimately became real, I think, creative strategies. Originally I was thinking, oh, I could do a training, I could read a book, and I said I would talk to my mentors regularly. But the more concrete those strategies were, the more meaningful they became. So I was doing this pre-pandemic. So when I just reviewed it, said, oh, phone calls with my mentors, which you would never say anymore. You would say Zoom or something. But I was doing phone calls with my mentors, but for what purpose? How often? What were we going to accomplish through those? So it became more of, we were going to collaborate on a scoping review if I really wanted to understand the interdisciplinary literature. I was going to be immersed into my mentors' existing partnerships to really understand how partnered research happens. I also, beyond the two people I chose, I found people that I wanted to learn something smaller from, and I created a scientific advisory board and got people's agreement for how they could help me. And so I talked about that in my mentoring plan. I also use my mentors in terms of networks, both in the URE space or in education spaces. But when I say creative, I also mean that, so on my campus, there was a big data initiative that was having grad student fellows, postdoctoral fellows, and I met with the director and said, can we create a faculty fellow? And that didn't exist, but I said, if I could carve out my time with foundation resources, would you incorporate me into this cohort? And we designed something really cool where I would be incorporated into the cohort, but then also students would be involved in my work. And so this really nice reciprocal relationship. So that's just an example of some creativity, and also just I was really clear in my mentoring plan and ultimately how I would get the time to work on all of these things, because the career development, as Amanda referenced, is really about carving out your time for doing some of these tasks. So how I would use sabbatical credits and how I would use course releases and what I would do with that time, independently but scaffolded by my mentors.
Thank you. I feel like you illustrated like the multi-layered nature and complexity within a mentor plan. That is not just about the two people, but how they potentially like provide avenues to do things, and open up multiple pathways to like expand your expertise. So I really appreciate you laying that out for us. Amanda, I'm gonna ask this one of you. Putting together a proposal, it's a daunting task. And so I think it can be helpful for people to understand challenges that you face when applying to the award, and also if there were any challenges that were specific to the use of research evidence.
Yeah, I think that it's quite an extensive application. I find that it took a lot more time than I thought it was going to, partially because, like Valerie said, you need to create and develop a mentoring plan that really nicely complements the research plan. And I think a lot of other career development awards, or even awards that include a mentoring component, don't put such a heavy weight onto that mentoring component. So I think I spent a lot more time working on that piece than I had anticipated. When it comes to challenges specific to the use of research evidence, I think, like we've said it multiple times, but navigating a fairly new area of literature takes time, but it also was surprising how much time it took for me to grasp the different language and the different terms used by the foundation and by people that publish in use of research evidence. So I had trained in Canada, where we learned about knowledge translation, knowledge exchange, knowledge mobilization. And those are all different, not just on the surface in terms of the words being used, but are slightly different because they're not always about how research evidence is used by key decision makers. And then even in my time working and training in the US, public health colleagues would often talk about policy translation or research to policy translation. And again, that wasn't fully grasping this idea of the use of research evidence. So I think navigating a new area of literature and language is something that I hadn't really anticipated. And I think one other part that, like Valerie mentioned, differed between my first and my second application when I reapplied for this was I found it really challenging to zoom in on the components of my project that had to do with the use of research evidence process and evaluation components. So my project included a lot of angles related to youth involvement, including the way youth set priorities for policy, the way youth survey their peers about policy, but tying that into how policymakers use research evidence as opposed to a yes/no, whether or not they use it, actually took a lot of conversations with my mentors, a lot of referring back to the literature, and making refinements to the study design so that I was actually answering the how instead of answering a yes or no question. And I thought that was something a bit more challenging.
Thank you. The last question I'll ask you both to speak to briefly. One of the things that it can be helpful for people to know about the Scholars Award is that about half the people who receive the grant in any given year have actually applied before. And so I think people don't appreciate the role of reapplying and what that means for a successful outcome. And so you each already mentioned that you had applied at least once before you received the grant. And so if you could just speak quickly to how you use the feedback and how you like re-prepared for that. Valerie, I'll start with you, and then Amanda, you can just jump in right after.
Yeah, I actually, I got this on my third try, so I had a lot of experience resubmitting. One thing that I did that was really important was that help synthesizing. So as much as I said there's homework to do before getting this grant about getting to know the URE literature, I started using my mentors before they were officially my mentors. And so they helped me group it and think about what the reviews were really saying. The reviews we got were extensive and they were so helpful, but it took a lot to weed through that. So if you apply, know that you'll get really useful feedback for resubmission, and then we had to prepare a resubmission statement. And if you come to the final round, there's even more levels of feedback and steps that Melissa will share, I'm sure. But for me, what I had to do is really, in my resubmission, in the end, I had to really show a deeper understanding of the URE literature. So just for an example, my project was going to be piloting some URE measures, kind of perfecting them, and then transporting them to other uses. And what I really did there was ignore the users in the use of research evidence inadvertently. So even though I had all these citations and I had really read the literature, it wasn't at my core. At my core, I wasn't embracing the URE literature fully, which said center the users. So I wound up doing that as a kind of project zero. I brought in at the front, talking to the users and letting them drive the process. And so that's just an example. And also using the open source repository for measures to understand, if you're going to promote the use of research evidence, you actually have to measure that. So really know the measures. And one final thing that I'll say is to talk to your dean if you're going to make a serious application in advance, because if other people are applying, you will have to compete with them internally, and your dean can help you manage that process, also help just tell you how they will manage a resubmission. If you got pretty far but not all the way, will they let you resubmit, or is it going to be someone else's turn? And I thought it was really helpful to know that. And my dean and I had a close relationship, and we talked about how much work I was doing as part of the proposal. And I was able to work with my dean for a course release just to help get a really solid proposal done. Once I had gotten far enough to get some great feedback and was offered an opportunity to revise. So this is an exciting opportunity, and usually deans are tremendous allies in helping you land a prestigious and exciting career opportunity. So I would talk to them up front and see if there's anything they can do to help you in that process.
Yeah, similar to Valerie, I shared my feedback with my mentors. So they're not officially your mentors until you get the award, but they were both really supportive and offered a lot of discussion and working through. We went through all of the points. The feedback that I got was also very detailed, very extensive, especially the bigger points that had to do with revising a study method or including like a different component to the mentorship plan. And I would just say that the resubmission process is like an R&R, like a revise and resubmit for any other paper. You address each point in the resubmission statement, you make the changes throughout, and you acknowledge every single point as if you were responding to reviewers on a journal article. And I found that was a pretty straightforward process.
Well, thank you both. I'm going to ask you to stay on, but we're moving to the question and answer session. And so many people sent in questions ahead of time. And so I'm going to take a few that came on, and then I'm going to pose one final question to both of you to close things out. And someone asked if a project could involve aspects of both reducing inequality and increasing the use of research evidence. And we discourage people from trying to fit their project into both buckets. It's really challenging to do that. And so people who attempt to do that are not successful within the proposal and review process. And so I would encourage you to really, just step back and think about the questions you're posing, which priority area do they fit best. I hope through the conversation with Valerie and Amanda that people are better able to see how distinct the improving the use of research evidence priority area really is from reducing inequality. Several people wanted to know if everything has to be intervention based. The answer is no. We fund a variety of studies. We fund just a few that I can think of. Again, we have Amanda who's doing, a study that's involving YPAR, youth participatory action research, and so that's not about an intervention. We fund lots of people who are using administrative data to do like policy evaluation studies. And so we do fund people who have interventions, but we fund the range of different methodological approaches to investigating, again, either reducing inequality or how you can improve the use of research evidence. And so I do hope that today's conversation has shown that it's not just about intervention research. And so the question that I will pose for you both, we already talked a little bit about the mentor, like putting together the mentoring plan from Valerie. And so Amanda, I'll start with you as like a follow-up. A lot of people sent in questions around, well, like, how do you choose a mentor, and like what makes a good mentor? And so I think it can be useful for people to know, like the mechanics of how you selected a mentor. Did you like set up phone calls that were, maybe you were obfuscating a little bit, but you're like trying to test out, like, do you have some intellectual chemistry with the person? Were you cold calling people? Were you asking for referrals from within your network? But just, like sort of the brass tacks of like, how did you choose mentors and what was your thinking? So Amanda, I'll start with you, and then Valerie, we'll close out the Q&A with you responding to that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So my mentors, I have two. One is an expert in YPAR, youth engaged research, especially as it pertains to health and health inequality. And the other mentor that I have is a URE expert, and in particular, someone who does use of research evidence work with state policymakers, who were the target audience that I was trying to work with. When it came to connecting with the YPAR expert, I knew someone who had published work with her before. I had been reading a lot of her work, and I was really interested in being able to connect with her. So I used a connection that I already had to match with this mentor, and that was how that connection worked out. We had a Zoom call, and things seemed to connect and worked out well. She seemed really committed to it. So that was one part of it. When it came to my URE mentor, actually, when I applied the first time, he was not part of my application. I didn't have a URE mentor. I had a mentor who was doing work in public health policy. And my reviewer feedback actually told me that that was not the same as use of research evidence related scholarship. They encouraged me to identify a new mentor if I was going to resubmit. And so they had identified somebody and recommended a person that I reached out to. That person told me they weren't available, and then they ended up connecting me with the person that would eventually become my mentor. So both of them were kind of indirect pathways. And I would encourage you to just reach out to your networks or to cold email people to see if they're interested in it. I think that most senior scholars are quite invested in mentoring early career scholars, and that they especially like it when it's part of a structured program like this, where the terms of the mentorship are outlined pretty easily in advance. And so I found it to be an indirect process, but one that was really rewarding, and I got connected with two scholars who I wouldn't have met otherwise.
I think I was a little bit too shy. I stayed, one person was on my campus. One person is someone that was a little bit, in my network already. And I wound up changing mentors once I was in the program, because they just weren't perfect fits for what I wanted to do or how my project evolved once I was in the program. So I think I would actually do things a little bit differently. And what I would encourage people to do is to look at folks who are funded by the foundation in the URE portfolio and have invested a lot of their thinking in URE already, and think about, since they're familiar with this program, they're familiar with the work, I think they're the most likely to be willingness. They're just good people for the most part in this whole community. And I think they'd be really open to getting an email, even if it was a cold email. And if they couldn't do it, they would probably hand you off to the next person or make a suggestion. So I think I would have been bolder. And now both of my mentors are folks that have been funded by the foundation doing URE work before. And it is just a beautiful relationship. And I kind of wish I would have jumped in that direction sooner. Melissa, we can't hear you again.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I was saying for people who are listening in, Valerie is a little bit further into her award than Amanda. So thanks for mentioning that, you started with one set, but now you have a different set of mentors. And that is something that our program allows for. It allows for you to change mentors because sometimes things aren't a great fit once you actually get into the project, or sometimes the research takes you in new directions and you need to add to your team in different ways than you had imagined when you first put the application for it. So I want to just take a moment to thank both of you for joining us today. As a foundation staff member, I saw both of your well, Amanda, I saw your application. Valerie, I've learned about your work since I've joined the foundation, but I know it from like the complete part. And so it was really cool to kind of hear about how it all came together. And so I appreciate that. And I'm sure that people who are with us here, but who will check this out online, they'll get a lot of like inside knowledge that they otherwise wouldn't have access to about putting together a compelling proposal. So again, thank you. And with that, feel free to go off camera, stay with us, or enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna close things out by just finishing out with talking a little bit about some things to keep in mind as you put together a proposal. It's always helpful to think about how you balance the ambition of your project with the feasibility of it. And so just at a more like fundamental level, the idea that you're going to prepare a project that requires you to stretch and grow in new ways, that's quite ambitious. But you also want to think about whether or not the stretch you're proposing, the research project you're proposing, is actually feasible within a 5-year framework. And so you do have to consider how you're stretching both those components. As Valerie and Amanda mentioned, get a good mentor or two. It's also great if you can be engaging with your mentor as you're writing your proposal. Valerie noted how useful it was to have the mentors helping her interpret things, but that she was also getting to know their research as she was putting together the proposal. And that's something that can be really helpful in crafting a compelling application. And again, we offer you the chance to view successful proposals. If you go to our website, we've annotated successful scholars' proposals. We have also recently annotated a successful use of research evidence abstract. Within the scholars application, you have to put together what we call an abstract. It's basically like a 6-page summary of your research project. And so we've annotated a recent URE grantees abstract. We've highlighted what selection committee members and external reviewers appreciated about the abstract, what staff members found compelling within the abstract, and we've also called out areas of their mentoring plan that were also particularly compelling as people were reading and reviewing the abstract. And then finally, just to talk a little bit about the review process, applications are due once a year in July. We start with senior staff reviewing all the applications that come in. At that point, we're primarily focused on fit with the foundation priorities and making a determination that this is actually a career development grant as opposed to a research grant, and also doing some eligibility checks. About 1/3 of the applications are screened out at that point. Applications that remain in the competition go on to the selection committee review process. 2 selection committee members review each application. We match applications based on the area of study and expertise and find appropriate selection committee members to review those. After the selection committee members review those applications, all but 10 and sometimes 10 to 11 of those applications are excluded at that point. And so after the selection committee process, those 10 to 11 finalists, those applications go out for an additional review. 2 external reviewers review each application. Finalists are also invited to do an in-person interview. That in-person interview is an opportunity to do a verbal response to reviewers, where you can respond to the critiques that have been raised throughout the review process and let the selection committee members know your plans for moving forward. After those interviews, the selection committee members recommend between 4 and 6 applicants to the board for approval. And if the board approves, those 4 to 6 people become the newest members of the William T. Grant Scholars Program. And so that's a little bit about the William T. Grant Scholars Award. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that this was informative and it gives you a better sense for how to put together a compelling use of research evidence application. If you have questions that were not answered, again, we'll be going through the questions that came in ahead of time, as well as any that have been entered in the chat, and following up where appropriate. But again, we refer you to the website that has a lot of information, especially basic information about the application process. You can find that all online. But again, really just want to thank you all. And this program, or this recording, will be made available online in about a week or so. I hope you all have a wonderful day.